The Mullah Asghar Memorial Library, an Islamic resource center, opened its doors on October 24, 2009. Dignitaries throughout were invited to share their views on the importance of this center, while Dr. Walji informed the visitors of the vision of this remarkable resource center.
Mu'mineen, this center will inshallah radiate the teachings of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam in a manner that is in keeping with the times, so that we are able to convey that message to the next generation and to the society at large.
In keeping with one of its aims of preserving and promoting the history and the heritage of the Khoja Shia Ithna Ashri community, the first ever Khoja Heritage Resource was established. It houses hundreds of manuscripts, photographs, and other historical records of the community since its establishment over 150 years ago. April 2011 saw the inauguration of its first exhibition on the Holy Quran, entitled From Parchment to the iPad. Displaying the Word of God through the expression of man, this exhibition was designed around the stunning thematic visuals to explore topics such as astronomy, embryology, nature, animals, as well as the value of foods mentioned in the Quran. Also on display was a collection of over 26 language translations of the Quran, which also include a Quran in Braille, a Quran which begins with the letter Aleph, as well as gadgets for reading and referring to the Quran. Saturday, September 15th, 2012, marked the opening of the Hajj exhibition. Over 8 months in preparation, the exhibition was designed to convey the deeply personal experience of Hajj, a journey of a lifetime for Muslims. The exhibition covered the route, rituals, and rationale of this journey from Jaffa all the way to Mina, with sounds and scenes to relive its spiritual awareness. All faith communities were able to enhance their understanding of the significance of the Hajj through numerous displays and presentations. The From the Roots of Abraham exhibition was inaugurated on September 13th, 2014, with visitors from multiple faiths exploring the common values of Abrahamic faiths. This exhibition offers Jewish, Christian, and Muslim men and women an opportunity to enhance their knowledge of one another's faiths and to increase the understanding and respect for all the Abrahamic religions. Prophet Abraham uniquely enjoys the unanimous admiration of the 3 major faith traditions of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. This consensus provides us with an opportunity to celebrate our commonalities. More than ever before, in these times of conflict and mistrust, MARC aspires to build positive relationships amongst all people. The Endangered Species, a history of the Khoja Shia Ithna Ashri community, was yet another project successfully completed by MARC. Shortly after, under the direction of Dr. Hasnain Walji, MARC produces a full 2-hour documentary, The Khojas, A Journey of Faith. This has received international acclaim as an anthropological film.
Story of a people on a journey of faith. Their spirit of inquiry inspired them not to be resigned to their fate, nor acquiesce to blind faith. Perplexed by their ancient Hindu beliefs, they put their thinking caps on in pursuit of the truth, meandering through a mystical path called Satpanth, and then onto the Nizari Ismaili Creed. They ultimately found the Shia Ithna Ashari faith. Faced with famine, they ventured beyond their ancestral homes of Sind, Kutch, and Kathiawar to an unexplored continent in search for better pastures. They turned the challenge into an opportunity and evolved into a thriving transnational community around the globe. They are called the Khojas, and this is their tale of travails, trials, tribulations, and triumphs.
Well, as all of us know, we've been affected by a certain thing called the COVID-19 pandemic for the last few months. Many of us, if not all, were in lockdown. And so all activities ceased at MARC, just as it ceased elsewhere. But as Hasnain Bai and I were talking, and Hasnain Bai Walji is the patron of MARC here, as we were talking about a month ago, we still needed, we felt, to fulfill our purpose as a library. So we came up with this idea of having conversations with authors and doing book reviews. Authors from our community as well as from the wider Muslim community, on topics of interest, on academic areas, and of course religious areas as well. And we're beginning today with a book, or should I say an author from our community who has had some really solid success in the area of literary work. And I'll be talking about her in a minute. We're here today, as I said, for the start, for the inaugural session of a series of thought-provoking discussions between myself or another moderator and a series of guests whom we have called and will be calling to join us. Let's turn to our first guest and author, and her name is Shelina Janmohamed. She is the best-selling author of Love in a Headscarf. There she is, you can see her now. A memoir about growing up as a British Muslim woman, now translated into 13 languages globally. Her second book, Generation M, Young Muslims Changing the World, is the defining book about the young Muslim identity today. Last week, only just last week, she published her first children's book called The Extraordinary Life of Serena Williams. She writes for the Daily Telegraph, The Guardian, The National, and the BBC. Shelina is also the Vice President of Ogilvy Islamic Marketing, the world's first bespoke global Islamic branding practice for building brands with Muslim audiences, which is part of the world's biggest advertising network. She was named one of the UK's 100 most powerful Muslim women, which makes me a little disconcerted and nervous, but anyway, I will live with it. And she has asked that if you wish to follow her and look at her activities, you can follow her via Twitter on @LoveInHeadscarf. That's @LoveInHeadscarf. So, Shelina, a very warm welcome to you, and thank you for joining us.
Assalamu alaikum to everybody, and thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited.
So let's begin. Shelina, given your academic degree in philosophy and psychology and your early career in the technology marketing sector, what motivated you to start writing, and what kind of journey has it been so far?
I never really thought about myself as a writer, but when I look back at my childhood, I start to see that actually there were signs of me exploring different writing styles, being really interested in producing articles and, unexpected essays. And yet nobody really picked that up as something that I had a talent for. So my journey as a writer really begins in 2005. And for those who can remember that far back, there was no such thing as social media. There was only blogging. So there was this new idea that you could set up a website and publish your own material. Anything before then that you wanted to be read by a wide audience had to be printed as a newsletter or actually put into the newspapers. And the reason that 2005 was important for me was that in the UK, that was when July the 7th happened, the attacks in London. And it came obviously quite soon after the attacks on September the 11th in 2001. And when I watched the news, it to me felt like there wasn't a strong British Muslim female voice. I felt like the people who were being interviewed, the commentary that was being made didn't really represent, at least to me, what it felt like to be Muslim, but also to be British. And within that, the female voice seemed to be completely absent. And so I started writing my blog. And I remember feeling terrified at this burden that I was writing something that other people would read. So I would ask my husband to check over that I hadn't said anything silly before I published it. But very quickly, my blog gained a following. And at that time, people would email through articles. And my first very soon after I started writing this, my first request actually came from the BBC to appear on their flagship news program, which is called Newsnight, which I have to say is a terrifying thing to do if you've never done TV before. And they wanted me just to talk very openly and honestly about my experiences of being a Muslim woman. And as my profile grew and more people started to read, they would ask me things like, why don't you write a book about what it's like to be a Muslim woman? And because I'd come at writing in a very accidental way, simply just to have my voice heard in a conversation where I felt my voice was absent, I just thought, oh, well, books, they're for footballers and pop stars and politicians and celebrities. Who am I? I just have a very ordinary life. Nobody's going to want to read a book by me. And then I remember going into our local bookshop one day, and there was a sort of display, they have them at the front of the store. And the topic of this display was something, kind of put Muslimi books together at the front. And they were just pictures of, kind of camels and these sort of sad women with niqabs, and, it would be like escaped and kidnapped and saved. And, the camels look sad in the back and the sand looks sad. And I just looked at all these stories and I thought, where is my story in this? Who's going to tell my experience of it? And that's where I thought to myself, if there is a gap, if there is a problem, who's going to solve it except yourself? And that was the motivation for me to start to write the book. And I thought long and hard about what I wanted this book to be about. And the obvious thing would have been that the book was, so you think Muslims are terrorists, I'm not a terrorist. But that didn't feel very true to who I was. And also, it's important to understand that in challenging a narrative, you can't simply entrench the narrative. So there's no point repeating back that you're not something, because it shouldn't be on you to prove that negative. And so I thought about all the things that were interesting to me. And I was really fascinated growing up by the idea of love. What does love for God mean? What does love for a community mean? What does love, when you watch Hollywood and Bollywood, mean about, this kind of living happily ever after? And so that's where the idea of Love in a Headscarf was born. And I wrote it, I think, at that time with a very clear intention, which was to just illuminate for people what it was like to be a Muslim woman and the pretty typical, ordinary things that we do that are just like other human beings, and to reach a mainstream audience. And so there was a little bit of me when I was writing the book that was thinking, oh, I need to write a very intellectual book about what does it mean to be Muslim, a very clever book. But I had to rein in that instinct, because actually I wanted the book to be read by as many people as possible. And ultimately that is what happened, because when we got through all the kind of publisher rejections, which we can talk about in a moment, and the challenges in the publishing process, it reached out to an audience that reads both the Daily Mail and the Guardian. I mean, that's really the audience that I wanted to reach, people who would never normally listen to a Muslim, who wouldn't pick up a textbook about being Muslims. And then, as you mentioned at the beginning, it's gone on to be translated into 13 different languages. So it really does have a global appeal. And so that, for me, is why I started writing. That's why I began on this journey, because I wanted to say something in the world that simply wasn't being said.
Okay. In the process of answering my first question, you very adeptly answered part of my second question, which was what inspired you to write your bestseller, Love in a Headscarf. So I'll turn to the second part of that, in that, do you think that there should be more work in this genre, or does it have very limited scope? And when I say genre, I mean books about not just Muslims, but our community, about the kinds of rituals and issues and everyday problems and challenges that we face. Is there room for more in this particular genre?
Well, I'm a huge advocate of capturing history, particularly, oral history, which, can very quickly be lost. So I'm a huge advocate of asking older people in particular to document their stories for us to hear what happened, because that specific experience can often be lost in the wider conversations. And in a way, that's why I included in that book a whole section about my family's history, because there is a little bit starting to be written about the experience of the subcontinent, about partition, about Pakistan and India and Bangladesh. But, where is the story of the East African Asian community? And while that community is small, it has a certain richness and texture to it. It has its own unique culture, and it also has a surprising influence because of, in a way, the privileges we've had of English language and British school teaching, and that aspiration for education. So there is a flavor to the East African Asian community, which I feel we really should be trying very hard to preserve, because it's completely absent, and we're going to lose it very quickly if we don't start documenting our oral history.
Early in the book, turning to Love in a Headscarf specifically, early in this book, after the meeting with Ali, you wrote a sentence that might be described now as prescient. And that sentence was, I quote, "It would take a search for my faith to reveal to me that my instinct was right, that love and practicality needed each other." Now, I say prescient, maybe for want of a better word, because later, after you had met several potential suitors, you went on to perform Hajj, the Islamic pilgrimage, and returned home with two new emotions: humility and patience.
What?
Not long afterwards, your prayers for a match, Mr. Islamic Right or Prince Charming, were answered. The implication is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted you to learn those emotions to better prepare you for meeting Mr. Right. Would you agree with that?
We don't know what, sorry, I'm feeling slightly emotional hearing that read back to me. We don't know what Allah holds for us, but until we're ready to go into that relationship, beyond all that Bollywood excitement and the Hollywood love ever after, I don't think we necessarily are set up for success. And one of the things which I write about in the book, and which will be familiar to many people listening, is that Marhum Mullah Asghar used to talk about that relationship that you build with the person you marry. And, I think many of us will remember, you would say love comes after marriage. And, when you're a starry-eyed teenager and you're watching all these kind of rom-coms and, star TV dramas, that's the furthest thing from your mind. And I think for me, it was finding a place which could accommodate that reality of what building a relationship is all about, but with a little bit of starry-eyed romance. I think there's nothing wrong with that. Mm-hmm. Sorry, my aunts and uncles are listening to this.
But you see what I mean, but that it was almost prescient, that you stated that, and then you went to Hajj, and it suddenly, not immediately afterwards, but not long afterwards, having met those two emotions and become Hajjiani, as it were, it all started happening for you, which was marvelous. So knowing what you know now about life and courtship rituals, what advice would you give to your younger self?
Goodness. Okay, well, don't tell anyone I said this, but that thing your parents say of Dayo Imani and Kandan Kutum?
Yes.
They're not wrong.
Okay. You want to elaborate on that?
I've talked about how, the Hollywood and Bollywood really talk about this kind of, the grand falling in love. And, we believe as Muslims that there is that strength of emotion that can and should be in our relationships of whatever kind they are, whether they are platonic or marital. Yeah. I think we shouldn't deprive ourselves of that hope that we can have that feeling and those relationships with those around us, particularly our spouse. But, I think what you grow to understand is just how much being a nice, good person who strives to be better and having those aligned goals is in marriage life. And I think it's trying to have that balance of, that excitement and delight, but the fact that you are trying to run a practical relationship. I can't believe I'm giving marriage advice on this seminar.
Yeah. We just got a text from a lady called Hannah who asked for a translation of what you just said, and I'll try and do my best with it. But in essence, what Shelina referred to here was the oft-quoted statement that is, when you're looking for a partner, look for somebody who is obviously of good character, of good integrity, and a family that has faith and iman, as it were, in God and our faith in general. So if you want to add anything more to that, Shelina, please do. Otherwise, we'll move on to the next question. I hope I translated it.
I think that was great. I have to say, I've struggled all these years to translate what it means, to be honest. So good translation.
Thank you. And Hannah, I hope that answered your question wherever you are. Okay, so moving on. Do you think that the experiences you described in the book are reflective of what young couples in our community still face? And is there one thing you believe needs to be done by our community leaders to help our youngsters find their life partners? So
I don't know who else on here has been watching this Netflix series called Indian Matchmaking.
Me.
And I think... So for those who haven't seen it, this is like a hit global TV series where the very traditional Indian approach of having a matchmaker to introduce families has become this worldwide phenomenon. And I think what that, along with things like, all the dating apps and marriage apps that people now have on their phone show, is that people still are seeking help to find the right person for them. So I don't think the Khoja community in that sense is any different to any other young people around the world who are looking for a partner. And I think we should embrace the fact that people are searching in that way and be very open and welcoming about it. And I think one of the things that I saw happen in the program Indian Matchmaking was people started a really practical and very important conversation about what are the parameters and what are the characteristics that you specify in your list of what you're looking for in somebody, and whether those perpetuate problematic issues in our communities. So, for example, in that series, there was a lot about, marrying of somebody who's fair or somebody who's tall or educated, but not too educated. Were women too picky, but men were allowed to choose who, go through hundreds of possible proposals. And I think that kind of conversation is quite healthy, because often when we talk about marriage, people will say, well, this list of criteria are this person's choice. And of course, we respect individual choice. But we also have to remember that choices don't come out of nowhere. They are reflective of our culture and our ideas and our thinking. And so this is where we need a reconciliation. So, for example, if we talk about the fact that the Prophet, peace be upon him, married Lady Khadija, who was, people differ on their opinions, but who was certainly at least somewhat older than him. How do we bring that into our community when people are saying that the man and the women need to be separated by age in a particular way? How do we think about beauty? How should a woman look? Does she need to be fair and slim? And people might remember this old phrase, fair, homely and domesticated. So I think those kind of questions about how we value a potential match, whether male or female, and what that says about our community are important discussions that we need to have.
Yeah. You actually went on to hint at this in your book much later on, where you said you thought that our community needs to do a collective reassessment of what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, at that time of life, in terms of our roles and our priorities in life. And I thought that was an interesting point. The other thing that came up was in Toronto, we ran a survey a few years ago to ask why people were having challenges or what they thought what the issue was. And one of the most common responses that came back from 300 young people whom we polled was accessibility, that they didn't have enough access or wide enough access to meeting people of like mind and of like faith and culture. So anyway, we'll leave that for another day. I'd like to get back to your books, and this time your second book, specifically Generation M, Young Muslims Changing the World. Tell us more about this book. What ideas were you hoping to convey in it, and do you think you succeeded?
After I published my first book, I was invited to go and work for Ogilvy, which is this advertising and branding agency all around the world. And they wanted to set up a division which was looking at how brands could talk to Muslim consumers. So the idea that there was some kind of identity among young Muslims in particular, where they were starting to engage with brands and being more demanding about things like halal and Islamic finance, but just generally the way that brands talked to them. And as part of that, I had already started some writing before I joined. We came up with an idea that it would be interesting to write a book which was a study of this particular young group, what motivated them, how they were expressing their faith, what it meant to them to live in the modern world. And their defining characteristic, which the book is hooked around, is that they are both faithful and modern. And they believe that as faithful Muslims, they can make the modern world better. But they also feel that there are things in the modern world that can go back and improve our practice of faith. And so the entire book is really an exploration of how visually they express themselves. Why was this sudden uprising, this sudden kind of growth of Muslim women wearing hijab, but not just wearing hijab, wearing it in a very fashionable way, often called hijabistas. Why did we suddenly see a proliferation of halal ready meals? Why were people setting up things like, halal hotels? And setting up music labels which were kind of halal boy bands. And really this entire generation was driven by two things: the spotlight from September the 11th, and for this particular group they decided their response was to own their identity and be proud of it, but also the rise of the internet, where suddenly they were no longer in little silos, they could connect with each other all around the world. And the idea of the book was to be really unapologetic about this identity, to be very positive about this whole generation that was growing up, and to present it to the world's CEOs. And I was able to stand up in front of many of them, including brands like Coca-Cola and Nestle, and talk about who Muslims were really, who they are and what they're really about. But also for thinking people, and as a way to platform young Muslim voices. I worked hard to get Love in a Headscarf published and to bring my own voice out. And the platform that gave me, I wanted to use that to showcase the voices of hundreds of other Muslims. I think there are more than 200 different voices that I quote in Generation M. And it's become a defining term. So people talk about Generation M, they refer to it in other studies. And, that's kind of nice because I'm not an academic, but I can kind of pretend to be an intellectual by doing that. But what I found most moving was that when I have given many, many presentations about Generation M, almost certainly there will be somebody who comes up to me in the audience and says, I thought I was alone in feeling this, but now I realize what my identity is, and I can be proud to be a Muslim, and I can know that there are other people like me. But also that when I have this conversation with my parents, I can realize that actually we're not at loggerheads with each other about how we are Muslim. It's just that we have different expressions of it. And I understand that now that I see the way that other people like me are expressing Islam. So my objective was to do nothing more than just let young Muslims tell their own stories, of which there is, a huge gap in the conversation that we have.
So that feedback you received must have been very gratifying from the sounds of it. And the other thing is the word you just mentioned. I'm going to have to add that to my vocabulary. I hadn't heard of that one before. Hijabistas. So thanks for the enlightenment there. Moving on. Let's turn now to my favorite topic, and that's tennis. As a tennis nut and as a tennis player, your latest work is a debut children's book about the all-time great professional tennis player, Serena Williams. And it's called The Extraordinary Life of Serena Williams. Now, you suddenly switched gears and you went towards the genre of children's books. What made you decide to make her the subject of a children's book? And how did the recent launch go?
So I have two young girls. They are aged 9 and 5. I think they're watching. So hi, girls. And
Hi,
as
girls.
I was listening to them and, you know, starting to really embrace their literature, something I hadn't really had much familiarity with before, I started to see how much what we read to our children and tell them about the world affects them immediately, but also I could see they were absorbing some of the ideas. And some children's books are just brilliant. There is some really great stuff I wish I had had when I was growing up, that take big and complicated ideas and simplify them and help give children a perspective on the world. And so I started to think about whether I might want to write something for them. And at that time, I got an invitation from Puffin Books, which is one of the premier children's publishers owned by Penguin Random House, which is one of the world's biggest publishing houses. And they said, would I like to write a biography? And I love the story of Serena Williams. She's so inspiring. You know, against all of the odds, she has gone on to become possibly the greatest of all time, certainly the greatest female tennis player of all time, possibly of, you know, whether male or female. And her story really tells us lots of things. So she grew up in poverty, in a very poor background in Compton, California. You know, she overcame poverty. The racism that she has faced in tennis has been extraordinary, but also the sexism that she's faced. But she's put to use so much inner strength that she's had. And she's fought off those personal demons that so many of us have, things like, you know, self-belief, doubt, the fact that she lost a lot and she picked herself up, that she has often been accused of being too angry, too emotional. She lost a couple of big championships because of her anger. But also she's overcome a lot of health challenges. So she's had surgery to her foot, surgery to her knee, surgery to her lungs. When she gave birth to her child, she had a very traumatic birth and was ill for a long time after that. And she's gone on to be an activist. So not only is she an amazing tennis player, she's also gone off to be a businesswoman, a fashion icon. She's really set her own terms. And she's not afraid, and what really spoke to me was that she's not afraid to talk about the challenges of being a mother and a working mother, and trying to strive to be your best, even while holding your children and your family very close to you. So I thought there was a lot in her story that all of us could relate to, but there was also a little bit that said to me, we need role models who are just great role models for everyone. So sometimes people say to me, well, did you pick her because you wanted to tell a story of a Black woman? And I said, no, I picked her because she is just fantastic, but she happens to be Black and she happens to be a woman. And I think that's the place that we want to get to in our stories, that you can have role models who are for boys and for girls and for grown-ups, and they just happen to shed light on some parts of our experience. Yeah. In a way, that's also why I chose her rather than so often people say, can I write a story about a Muslim audience? And there's something really, it's been important to me in my career to talk about my Muslim identity. I mean, my first 2 books are about it. But I think all of us have to show that there is so much to us beyond just what other people perceive as our Muslim identity.
Yeah. I agree. Yes, indeed, Serena has been a great inspiration to all young women, girls alike, as well as to young men and boys, in terms of the characteristics and the qualities that you described. I still remember back in 1999 when my 2 daughters were young, they were just, when Serena broke through the rankings, they were just totally awed by her. But so good luck in that. And you didn't mention how the launch went. Is it going well so far? And were you busy last week?
I've been completely overwhelmed at the love that it's receiving. I've been receiving photos from people holding up their copy of the book as they're about to read it to their kids. Although I'm not sure they're reading it to their kids. I think they're reading it for themselves, which is fine. I don't mind.
Yes, I'm planning to buy a copy and say it's for my nephew. So anyway, but that's mine. Okay, my last question before we turn it over to the audience is, what other issues or topics would you like to see Muslim writers tackle in literature?
Anything they like. And I think that's really the thing that we should be thinking about in literature. Just because you are of a particular background, to date, publishing and writing has too often restricted people from Asian or Muslim backgrounds to just writing about that Muslim or Asian experience, as though we can only be other. And the only thing we can talk about is the experience of being other. And actually, I would say that we need to encourage people to write on anything, that anywhere that their passion takes them and their talent allows them for. Yes, there is a need for history, and yes, there is a need for stories that talk about our experiences as, you know, South Asians or as Muslims. But, you know, for anyone who's listening, if you want to write a story and make it brilliant.
Okay, that's great advice. Thanks, Shelina. All right. So this question, Shelina, comes from Sabika Shaban, and it says, were there challenges particular to publishing a Muslim story for Love in a Headscarf, or is it a fashionable genre to write about?
So Love in a Headscarf was, thank you for your question, by the way. Love in a Headscarf was published in 2009. And since then, I've been so gratified to see that there has been a lot more literature produced by Muslim women telling their own stories. And I'm hoping Love in a Headscarf was the trigger, and its success was able to open those doors. But when I was going to publishers with my proposal in 2007, 2008, what I found was either outright rejections or just a complete lack of comprehension that there could be a positive and upbeat story to be told. Because as I was describing, the stories of Muslim women were all about, you know, being miserable and escaping for Islam. And so they just couldn't understand, firstly, how this story even existed. But secondly, they couldn't understand how there could be a commercial market for this. And this is the trap that you find in publishing and news and other content creation sectors, is that because they've never written a book like this or produced some content like that, they think there's no audience for it. And actually, as the publication of the book proved, there was an audience for it. They just simply were too blind or risk averse to do it. Things have moved on, and there is a very robust conversation going on in publishing now, triggered really by the recent Black Lives Matter movement in May, that there is a mea culpa, that they've assumed that their audience is white middle class and therefore have been writing stories for those. And actually there is a much bigger audience. Now, the question is, are they going to live up to that mea culpa? And they're going to start publishing a much more diverse range of authors. But yes, I have that thing that authors talk about, that pile of rejection slips, that, you know, of people who didn't want to publish it. But, you know, we got through, and there was one publisher who took a punt, and that's all you need to change history.
Okay.
I have a question on identity. You know, with the roots in the subcontinent, being Khoja, having connection with East Africa, with your parents, and born and bred in Britain, how do you identify yourself when you're asked as to what's your identity?
What a great question. So it kind of depends who's asking the question, but I think in the main, I call myself a British, East African, Indian, Muslim woman. Which is a bit of a mouthful. And I think, you know, in my earlier years, and actually in an earlier stage in our social discussion, was difficult. I think we've now reached a point where people are more accepting of the fact that you can have multiple facets to your identity and you can inhabit those different skins. But I think as individuals, it can be quite tough because, you know, you're trying to be a bit of this and a bit of that, but you're never quite any of them. And for me, the journey that I was describing in Love in a Headscarf was about how, for me, that reconciliation came through my faith, which felt like a very natural umbrella way to embrace all those different parts of my identity. But it's a struggle that I think lots of people have. And it's not one that we should dismiss, because it's very existential when people are struggling to work out who they are and what their place is and how they express themselves. That can create a lot of internal turmoil. So that is definitely something that young Muslims in particular, those of different ethnic backgrounds, need to talk about. And I think, when I look back on growing up, it felt like being Muslim and being Indian and being East African was difficult. And then, I don't know, it kind of felt like maybe it was a little bit easier for a while, but the scrutiny has really redoubled in recent years, from the rise in the far right, what we've seen happening in the US, what we've seen happening in the UK with Brexit. And I think those challenges are being re-inflamed for young Muslims. So I think it's something we definitely need to take quite seriously.
Okay, so what age is the Shelina book aimed for?
I think it's 7 or 8 plus. So my 9-year-old's been enjoying it with me. I have actually, the 5-year-old's been listening in, and I think the illustrations are quite good, but some of the concepts might be a little bit beyond somebody younger than 7 or 8.
Okay, so the next question is, was it easy to write about Shelina too, being a Muslim, where we are not supposed to have any biases of any sort?
I'm not quite sure what the question is in terms of not having biases, but as I was explaining, I think what she has achieved and what she has overcome have a lot for us to gain from and be inspired by. When we have somebody that we find inspiring and who's achieved a lot, we don't necessarily have to agree with everything that they've done, but there are some amazing lessons in how she's got to where she's got and the kind of things that she's speaking about. And I think when we present a range of inspirations and role models, that's what we're seeking for them, is different things to help to energize us in achieving the goals that we are setting for ourselves.
It seems that there's more interest in Shelina. There's another question related to that. Did you meet Shelina in the process of writing the book? And have you heard from her since having it published?
No, I didn't meet her, sadly. I would love to. I'm a huge fan. However, her husband has tweeted me. So I think I'm just going to take that for the time being, because that's pretty awesome.
Okay, so there's
Hi,
another question.
Can I talk?
Sure, go ahead. Who's this Kanisba?
Yes, I don't see a hand sign, so
okay, go ahead, please, Kanisba.
I unmuted myself. Assalamu alaikum, Shelina.
Alaikum salam.
Oh my God, I'm so proud of you. You mentioned all your uncles are watching. How about your aunties are watching too?
You were the first to join, so.
She's, by the way, my sister's daughter. And she has been growing up, by God, we're all so proud of her. And she's been wearing a scarf since she was young. And, she must have gone through a very hard time going through school and university, going to school and university in a headscarf. So the title of the book, Love in a Headscarf, just is so appropriate, Shelina. Thank you so much. We're very, very proud of you. Thank you. Good Hafiz.
So go ahead, Shelina. Do you want to say anything?
Sorry, did you ask Shelina to comment?
Yes, please, Shelina.
What can I say other than, any success I have is from my family and my parents and my community. And, I'm so grateful and thankful to everyone's encouragement and support and positivity. I know my writing sometimes has been unexpected, and sometimes it's full of love and compassion, and sometimes it talks about things that are difficult to talk about. But through all of that, I'm so thankful that my aunts and uncles, my parents, my husband and kids, I feel like I'm doing an Oscar ceremony acceptance speech now. They've all been so amazing, and that's what keeps you going when you have people on your side. And I would say that if you ever see somebody in a public forum who is saying something that you feel needs to be said, please do go and show them your appreciation, because talking entirely from personal experience, it makes all the difference to know that people have absorbed what you've said and that they are supporting you, especially when you're trying to say something difficult. So thank you, Kanizanti, and thank you everyone for all of your support.
Okay, so here's another question. Did you ever in your career have to compromise with your principles?
That's a really great question. I have to say I've been very lucky that I don't feel as though I've had to compromise my principles. Whether I've made mistakes, of course, is a different question. My view has always been that if I need to do something or go somewhere that isn't in line with my principles, then that's not somewhere I want to be. But I'm conscious that I work in a job which is about being Muslim and about asserting my Muslim identity. So in many senses, that's a lot easier for me than many other people. And so I think we have to recognize that the workplace and the world can be difficult for Muslims. But, you know, we've got to try our best. And I hope I've been doing that.
This is a very interesting question. What advice would you give to upcoming writers when querying agents with your story? And can you talk about the editing process you went through with the publisher in respect to For Love in a Headscarf?
So there's two parts to publishing a book. The first is the writing the content. So if it's a fiction book, you would write the story, and for nonfiction, obviously there's the content that you're producing. And it's very easy when you're an author to get very wrapped up in the story that you're writing and the content. And it's really important, as I was saying earlier, to write brilliantly and to have a great idea. And things like regular writing, thinking about what's going on in the world, reading other people's writing, and so on is important. But when you come to taking the step between the material you've written and securing a publisher, you have to shift hats and you have to start thinking commercially. Your book then becomes a product, and you are trying to persuade the publisher why your product is going to sell. And that's very difficult when you're an author, because you love your story and you want it, you see it in the world. And that's often why people will get an agent to help craft them. But essentially, you need to work out, what is your book trying to say that hasn't been said before? Like, what is the gap? What is the new story that your book is saying? And so people often talk about, you know, what's the one sentence description, or what's your elevator pitch, and so on. And then you would write a full proposal, and there's lots of guidance online for those of you who might want to write one, because then you're creating a sales document. What is this product? What is the idea about? Who's going to buy it? You know, has there been anything else like this before? And then what are the details of the book going to be in it? So it becomes quite a commercial conversation, but you have to retain your sense of being an author within that. If you secure a contract and you get into the writing and the editing process, you have to submit a manuscript of a certain number of words. So I think Love in a Headscarf was about 80,000 words. Generation M was a lot more. It's about 110,000. I think the Serena Williams book, because children's books tend to be a lot shorter, was about 10,000. You submit a first manuscript, your editor sends it back to you with their comments. Sometimes they can be quite light. Usually they're asking for a restructure, and a lot of authors talk about that kind of disheartening feeling when you get the comments back on your first script. You then write a subsequent draft, or as many drafts as are required. And that's a back and forth with your editor, who will be editing your work. And that's quite... that can be quite challenging as an author, because you feel so connected to your work that you can feel almost quite offensive if somebody's trying to edit it. But the role of the editor is really important in making sure that your work shines, that it's very tight, that the things you're trying to say come out, and that the readers can follow what you're talking about. And a really great editor will make your work better than it was when you started. And then the final stage, once you have a final manuscript, it will go through, depending on whether it's fiction or non-fiction, it will go through fact checking, copy editing, which is just checking that, you know, there's consistency through the book. And then there'll be a final stage of proofing, where they go through and check that everything is correct. Then they'll lay your book out, so how it's going to appear on the page and kind of what little flourishes there might be. And then that finally will go to print. And then there's a separate process, which is about commissioning the cover art. And that, along with the choice of title and the subtitle, obviously is really the packaging, the gifting that brings your book to life. And some authors get very involved in the cover art and some don't get involved at all. So for Love in a Headscarf, I was very intimately involved, because for me, the the image on the cover was as important as the story of the Muslim women within it. And I had to have a real struggle with the editor about creating that image. And I think it was worth it. That creative struggle that we had, I think, produced something that was extremely fresh in the market, and actually went on to become the cover for many of the other languages as well. The same happened with Generation M. We wanted to really give it that cool feel that had attitude. On the other hand, the Serena Williams book, the illustrator and the cover were all commissioned by the publishing house, and other than being shown it and asked if there were any corrections to be made, that was something that wasn't that I didn't particularly get involved in, because it looked great to me and it brought the story out. So at all of those different stages, there's quite a lot of work that goes into it by the author and the editor, which as the reader you simply don't see, and that's why it can take something like a year from when a book contract is signed to when the book actually gets published.
Okay, so there's a related question to manuscript. Do you find it more effective to outline your manuscripts or write the scenes as they come?
I tend to be a kind of, I'll get a big piece of paper and I'll kind of write my ideas on it. And then I'll get another big piece of paper and then I'll try and group my ideas together, and that will help me get a structure for the book. And then I start to fill in the details between it, and then they'll kind of go through a multiple editing process. So that's what works for me. Obviously, every author has a different approach to it.
And what's your next book going to be on?
Come back and ask me in a few weeks. I've got a few projects in the pipeline. Can't tell you anything yet.
So Salams, would you recommend any authors who are carrying your kind of work forward in terms of promoting Muslim values through writing and showing that Muslims are equal to others in terms of the human experience and so on, and whom we can read while we wait your next book?
Well, it might take a while before my next book is out. As I was saying, it can take at least a year for something to come out. So you might need a pile of books. There are a lot of really great books coming out by Muslim authors. You know, the breadth and the variety has really grown over the last few years. I'm not sure I want to list them all off. Maybe offline with the folks at MARC, we can maybe start compiling a list of a reading list for people.
A couple of comments here, Shelina, from Fatima in Nairobi. Shelina, I haven't read any of your books, but I will now. And Shelina, this is up to you to respond to as you wish. In the institution of marriage in Islam, there's an embrace all approach to welcome marrying outside your own culture, which seems very difficult for many culturally centered communities to accept. One of the major arguments to marry within the same culture is to protect its values. What are your thoughts on this faith versus culture dichotomy? And side comment, absolutely love the sense of humor throughout the book. And by the way, I'll echo that. I was laughing quite a bit.
Well, to address that, it was really important to me that the book was funny, because Muslims and Muslim women are so often portrayed as, you know, kind of grim, miserable, oppressed, very serious people, and that kind of lightness was really important to me in the book. Plus also, I would really hope that I'm funny in real life too, but don't answer that. So, you know, this is a good question about faith and culture. You know, how do you know, culture is important. It's what makes us, and the Khoja community has a very strong sense of culture, which is important to the issues that we were talking about earlier in terms of keeping your identity strong and keeping you grounded. And I think, you know, how does that contribute to a faithful identity? Well, I think if cultures are naturally inclined towards upholding values which are also Islamic, then of course that's going to make things easier. The confusion comes, of course, when things that are, you know, traditional cultural norms are kind of passed off as Islamic and then get entrenched. So I think that's not a tension that only this community is going through. I think that's a struggle that a lot of communities are going through, and in a way is part of the emergence of this group I was talking about, Generation M, who said, you know what, all this kind of culture and all this tradition and all these things that you're supposed to do according to your parents, who many of whom would not have had, you know, really strong Islamic grounding other than what was passed down to them. They're saying, actually, we want to rediscover our faith and go back to the roots of it to see how it applies in our lives. So I think we shouldn't feel lonely that we're going through the struggle of faith and culture, but we should also realize that there is something important to hold on to in the culture we have, but not at the expense of our faith and our faithful identity. So as we wrap up, I'd like to first of all thank Shelina Janmohamed for joining us today for what was our inaugural session. I'd also like to wish her all the very best in her future writing career, and to let her know that we are indeed all proud of her. I know nobody's more proud of her than her aunt Kaniz Kimji, but we are also as proud, if not more. So well done, and best of luck for the future. We'll be watching you, and maybe we'll have you back one day for another book. Inshallah. And to my audience, or to the audience at large, thank you for tuning in. Thank you for joining us today. If you liked what you heard, and even if you didn't like what you heard, please send us some feedback, because it's only by receiving your feedback and understanding what you like, what you didn't like, that we can then go away and sharpen the tools in our box to give you a better product next time. This was our first one, so if we made any major errors or mistakes, or if we offended any of you, then please forgive us. And I'd just like to thank Hasnain Karim very much for managing the studio for us. As always, he did a sterling job. And also to Hasnain Baiwalji for providing the support and being on the call to work us through it.